Hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the final video of the Our Mutual Friend Victorian-style serialised read-along. The end has come, it's very weird, but yeah, I'm going to talk about the last few chapters of Our Mutual Friend. So, over the last 18 months, which is a very long time, I have been hosting a serialised Victorian-style read-along of this glorious, glorious book, and November was the final month. I'm sorry this video is a few weeks late as usual, but I have finished Our Mutual Friend, and today I'm going to talk about the final few chapters of the book. I also will be making a video about my general thoughts on reading serially, because it's been a slightly odd experience, and also with potential discussions of the next Victorian-style serialised read-along, so that video will be up in a few days or weeks as well. But in the meantime, the chapters I'm going to be talking about today are Book the Fourth, Chapter 12, The Passing Shadow, Chapter 13, Showing How the Golden Dustman Helped to Scatter Dust, Chapter 14, Checkmate to the Friendly Move, Chapter 15, What Was Caught in the Traps That Were Set, Chapter 16, Persons and Things in General, and Chapter the Last, The Voice of Society. 6 chapters in this video, so I would grab yourself a cup of tea because we may be here for quite a while. So, Chapter 12, The Passing Shadow. This is an interesting chapter in which the sort of John Harmon, John Rokesmith plotline is finally coming to a head. John and Bella's baby is born, and a little while after that they're walking out in the street, and who do they run into but Mr. Lightwood, who has of course only seen Mr. Rokesmith once before, and once before when he saw him he was going under the name Julius Handford, and he was in suspicious circumstances identifying the body of John Harmon. So Mr. Lightwood is now quite concerned. John Rokesmith and his wife go away. Bella doesn't ask John why he assumed a false name. She decides that he should tell her in his own time, and that she won't question him because her trust in him is absolute. And later on that day, a police inspector comes to their house. Bella accompanies John to the police station. After a little while he is released again. Bella is completely confused but still does not make John tell her what is going on. And then John tells Bella that his company that he was working for has now dissolved and that he's got a new place, that they're going to have to move house. She's a little bit confused but goes along with it. He says, would she like to come with him to see their new house? And then they travel to the Boffin's house. They walk through the doors and Bella is rightfully quite confused as to what on earth is going on. So, points of interest in this chapter. Before I begin talking about the relationship between John and Bella, which I think is the most interesting thing in this chapter, I do want to quickly talk a little bit about the baby, because the baby is a glorious, glorious character. She soon proved to be a baby of wonderful intelligence, evincing the strongest objection to her grandmother's society, and being invariably seized with a painful acidity of the stomach when that dignified lady honoured her with any attention. I just find that one of the funniest jokes in Dickens, that Bella's baby is incredibly clever because every time the baby's grandmother, Mrs. Wilfer, comes near her, the baby throws up on her. I find that very, very funny. I really like Bella's relationship with her baby and how she kind of enjoys motherhood, but also in a slightly playful way, in the same way that she enjoys like mothering her father, but at the same time is very, very fond of her child and loves her very dearly. And I think that kind of relationship and the idea that motherhood might change Bella slightly for the better, as her marriage has, is quite interesting here. But the main thing I do want to talk about in this chapter is the relationship between Bella and John, and the trust in John that Bella implicitly has, and let's be honest, kind of shouldn't have. Like, I love Bella Wilfer so much as a character. She's one of my absolute favourite characters, and I think she's so interesting, and I really, really like her. But also, at times, I do get quite frustrated with her. And on the one hand, she's married to John, and she loves him, and therefore she trusts him, and she allows him to take his own time to tell her stuff. But also, he has been lying to her for, like, all the time they've known each other. And I really, at times, just want her to shout at him, which she doesn't do. But at the same time, I find it quite sad, because there are moments where, although she doesn't shout at him, she gets as close to challenging him as she can. When John says that he has left the China house where he's been working and that he's moving to a new company and that he's got a new house and that they're going to have to move, and Bella, who loves this house, is quite disappointed to leave, she doesn't feel that she can challenge him. She tells him that's a gain, and when he's kind of aware that she is not completely happy with this, rather than challenging it herself, she makes the baby challenge it. She pretends to speak in the baby's voice and she says, I won't allow you to make a game of my venerable ma. She herself doesn't feel able to stand up to her husband almost, so she makes her baby do it for her by making a game of it, like Bella has always in her life made a game of things in order to cope with serious situations that she can't cope with. For example, the way that her and her father talk to each other, and the way that they use a kind of role reversal and make a game of their father-daughter relationship to make it a kind of mother-son relationship in order to cope with the fact that the rest of their family are not people they really like very much. In some ways, Bella does remind me of Jenny Wren in that same way that she uses like storytelling and pretense in order to cope with situations in life. This book, as I will talk about in the next chapter, is like so much about pretense. John is pretending so many things to Bella, but Bella is also pretending, I think, at times to cope with the situation better than she does, and she pretends to make a game of things that she knows are not a game. And I find Bella such an interesting character because I think for Dickens, part of Bella's moral transformation is now that her trust is implicitly in her husband, that she trusts him entirely because they are married. I think this is quite bound up in Victorian ideas of gender and marriage, and the idea of the woman having to trust to her husband's judgment in things. But at the same time, it's not just to do with gender, it's also to do with love, and it's also to do with the fact that for Bella, a lot of the time in her new life, in her marriage, I think she is atoning for believing that she was a bad person previously, believing that she did not trust enough in people, and therefore now she has to trust entirely in John because she still doesn't feel she's worthy of him. Like, I find Mr. Rokesmith such a problematic character, and I find their relationship so problematic because he just lies to her for so long, and I don't think she should be as accepting of it as she is. And also because I do think it is a lot to do with Victorian ideas of gender, the idea that for Dickens, for Bella to be a reformed woman, to be a good person, she must have complete trust in her husband no matter what. John comments to her that she hasn't asked him why he went under the name Julius Handford. She says, "I should dearly like to know, of course, but I wait until you can tell me of your own free will. You asked me if I have perfect faith in you, and I said yes, and I meant it." Later, when he says to her that he has done no wrong, he says, "Shall I swear it? No, John, never to me. I can trust you, John dear, with all my soul. If I could not trust you, I should fall dead at your feet." On the one hand, I think there is something quite compelling and something quite moving and touching about Bella's love for John, but on the other hand, sometimes I really want her to question him because, seriously, John, seriously. But that is all I have to say on that chapter. I will go on to talk about similar themes in the next chapter, chapter 13, showing how the Golden Dustman helped to scatter dust. Or in other words, the chapter where we discover that Mr. Boffin was nice all along. In this chapter, Bella and John have turned up at the Boffins' house. In this chapter, Bella and John have turned up at the Boffins' house, and Mr. Boffin and Mrs. Boffin begin to tell Bella everything that has been going on over the course of the book, some of which we knew and some of which we didn't know. Mrs. Boffin tells Bella that John Rokesmith is not actually John Rokesmith, but is actually John Harmon, and explains that she and Mr. Boffin have known all along for a very long time, since the night that John proposed to Bella and she rejected him. Mr. and Mrs. Boffin tell John that they've recognised him, but he says he has no intention of coming to life as John Harmon to get his fortune. But they say that actually they think Bella could learn to love John Rokesmith, and basically the three of them concoct a plan that Mr. Boffin will behave terribly to John as Mr. Rokesmith in order to get Bella to stand up for him, and in order to show Bella how damaging money can be, though of course it's not actually damaging Mr. Boffin, he's just pretending, and also that Mr. Boffin can at the same time pretend to be hard-hearted in order to sort of get around Weg, who he knows is sort of planning something on him. The three of them, Mr. Boffin, Mrs. Boffin and John, kind of plotted together in order to present a certain situation in order to get Bella to fall in love with John and to get her to ultimately marry him, kind of. Bella is reconciled with the Boffins, she forgives John very, very happily, has no objection to the fact that he's lied to her for like a year or more, and everything kind of ends happily with the Boffins meeting the baby, etc. Points of interest in this chapter, oh my. Before I get on to talking about the revelation, I do just want to mention one paragraph which I really, really like when Mrs. Boffin talks about John Rokesmith, because one of the things I really like about John as a character, and one of the things I think does make him slightly more sympathetic for me, is his relationship with Mrs. Boffin, the kind of mother-son bond they have. Mrs. Boffin says, "I looked in and saw him sitting lonely by his fire, brooding over it. He chanced to look up with a pleased kind of smile in my company when he saw me, and in that single moment every grain of gunpowder that had been lying sprinkled thick about him ever since I first set eyes on him as a man at the bower took fire. Too many a time had I seen him sitting lonely when he was a poor child to be pitied heart and hand. Too many a time had I seen him in need of being brightened up with a comforting word. Too many a time to be mistaken when that glimpse of him come at last. No, no, I just makes out to cry, 'I know you now, you're John!' And he catches me as I drops." When I first watched the television adaptation and when I first read the book, I loved this chapter so much, but over time I've grown to find this chapter quite frustrating. They basically plot to make Bella fall in love with John. Which is kind of dubious, isn't it? Like, I love this book very, very much, but sometimes I find it quite hard to separate, like, my current thoughts and feelings on the book to, like, my 14-year-old thoughts and feelings on the book when I first read it. But when I first read it, John and Bella were my favourite couple. I loved them very, very much. And I think that's partly as well because I saw the television adaptation before I read the book, and I find the character of John Harmon, John Rokesmith, a little bit more sympathetic in the television adaptation than I find him in the book. When I was 14, they were definitely my favourite couple, and Bella and John were, like, my favourite characters. But over time, that has changed slightly. And one thing I do think is interesting is that up to the middle of the book-ish, where we find out that he's John Harmon, at that stage I have quite a lot of sympathy towards him, and also about the extent to which he lies, because you can kind of get that he didn't really intend to get into this situation and it's kind of all gone a little bit out of control. But I feel like there are a lot of stages where he really ought to have told Bella who he is, and I find it very frustrating that Dickens makes Bella, like, quite so absolutely fine about the fact that they've lied to her for ages. "You said, my pretty," Mrs. Boffin reminded Bella, "that there was one other thing you couldn't understand." "Oh yes," cried Bella, covering her face with her hands, "but that I shall never be able to understand as long as I live. It is how John could love me so when I so little deserved it, and how you, Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, could be so forgetful of yourselves and take such pains and troubles to make me a little better, and after all to help him to so unworthy a wife. But I am very grateful." But I really feel like she shouldn't be, because I know that she now feels that she's a much better person, but also they did, like, lie a lot. It really grates me that they basically lied to Bella, and that, like, her whole relationship with her husband has been a lie, basically. That's quite problematic, isn't it? One of the reasons why I talk a lot about why this book is all about pretense is to do with this. For the whole of the book, John is pretending to be someone else, and for half the book so is Mr. Boffin, and Bella is kind of led into this marriage by pretense. Oh, she loves him, they love each other, they will be happy, and it's suggested in the course of the end of the book that they will go on to be happy. She very happily forgives John. I don't know, it kind of annoys me a little bit that some of my favourite scenes in the book are pretenses. At the same time, there are some very clever things earlier on in the book where Dickens kind of hints at the pretense, because when I first read it, I couldn't work out whether this was planned or not, or whether Dickens had, like, written himself into a hole and wanted to make the Boffins actually good. But actually, I don't think that's true, and I think you can see that's not true when you look at the plans that he had for each chapter. But also I think you can see it's not true because there are a few mentions and a few seeds of this earlier on. One is partly just the fact that the theme of pretense is a massive theme in this. There is so much to do with pretense and play acting and playing a part. There is so much in this book to do with society and the facade of that, but also to do with characters who sort of pretend their situations are slightly different to they are, even if they just do it in play, like Jenny Wren or Bella. And that's one of the things I find so interesting about this book, and one of the themes I think is most important and significant, and that it's been really interesting to pick up on, especially on this read-along, this reread for me. But another thing that I think is quite interesting is that there are a few points where Dickens does kind of sow seeds. For example, in the chapter where Mr. Boffin is being read to by Mr. Wegg from, like, the misers, the particular misers that Mr. Boffin gets Mr. Wegg to read are all to do with, like, things being hidden in places, because he is, like, tempting them and he's kind of mocking them. And actually, once you read that chapter again, knowing that Mr. Boffin is actually good and that he knows Wegg is kind of after his money and that he's kind of goading him, it's actually really, really funny the way that Mr. Boffin is plotting this. And there's a few other details and mentions there as well in things from Bella's perspective. Bella mentions that although Mr. Boffin buys all these miser books, he never actually talks about the misers or mentions them, and that's because he hasn't actually been doing much reading of them and he doesn't actually care about them, and he's not taking in what Wegg reads to him because it's all just a part. I don't think I have that much more to say on this chapter. I find Bella and John very problematic, but also I kind of love them, so it's quite hard. That's, like, my feeling towards a lot of Dickens, to be honest. But it's such an interesting chapter, it's such an interesting book, it's such an interesting plot device, and the story of Bella and John is so thoroughly interesting. But I do want to go on and talk about the next chapter now, and that is chapter 14, Checkmate, the Friendly Move. In this chapter we once again encounter Mr. Wegg and Mr. Venus. Mr. Venus actually is another instance of pretense, because as we discover in this chapter he's been pretending to Mr. Wegg for quite a while, but anyway. Mr. Wegg is surprised to find Mr. Venus's place rather a lot cleaner than it normally is, and also Mr. Venus himself rather a lot cleaner than he normally is, and discovers that Mr. Venus is actually quite soon to be married to Pleasant Riderhood, who had previously rejected him. Mr. Wegg and Mr. Venus head to Mr. Boffin to confront him with their newer will and to ask him to pay up. When they get there, they find that things are not quite as Mr. Wegg anticipated. Mr. Venus breaks with Mr. Wegg and calls him a precious old rascal, which I do very much enjoy. And when Mr. Wegg asks Mr. Boffin if he's going to buy the will, Mr. Boffin says No. John has by this time been identified as being John Harmon, so Mr. Wegg turns instead to him and asks him how much the will is worth to him, and he tells him that it is worth absolutely nothing, because although the will that is currently in place is an older will than the will Wegg has, there is in fact a newer will, which rather than leaving any money to John, leaves all the money to Mr. Boffin. Mr. Wegg is rather disappointed, leaves in disgrace, and is promptly pitched into a rubbish cart by Sloppy. I love Sloppy. No points of interest in this chapter. I don't know that I actually have that much to say. I'm sure I will find stuff to say once I start talking, but I do enjoy this chapter. As I said, the previous chapter showing how the Goldman Dustman helped to scatter dust is a chapter I don't find that satisfying as an ending to the book, and it's one I find a little bit frustrating. But this chapter I find so thoroughly satisfying, and I feel like it's precisely the right thing to happen, because I love Mr. Venus and I'm so happy that Mr. Venus gets a happy ending, but also I dislike Mr. Wegg so much, and I'm glad he gets a rubbish ending, and also an ending in which he is outwitted, because part of what he prides himself in is his intelligence and the fact that he thinks he is so much more deserving of Mr. Boffin because he can read and Mr. Boffin can't. To illustrate one of the reasons why I like Mr. Venus so much and why I find him such a glorious character, I just want to read a little bit of dialogue. When Mr. Venus tells Mr. Wegg that he's going to get married, Silas Wegg says, "To the old party?" "Mr. Wegg," said Mr. Venus in a sudden flash of wrath, "the lady in question is not an old party." "I meant," explained Wegg testily, "to the party as formerly objected." "Mr. Wegg," said Mr. Venus, "in a case of so much delicacy I must trouble you to say what you mean. There are strings that must not be played upon, no sir, not sounded unless in the most respectful and tuneful manner. Of such melodious strings is Miss Pleasant Riderhood formed." He's such a strange character, definitely one of my favourites in Our Mutual Friend. I also want to quickly mention John's character in this chapter, because John is quite violent in this chapter, in a way that John Rokesmith isn't usually, and doesn't usually appear, which again makes me think that Bella should not be quite so trusting of him in all of his lying, but that's beside the point. The moment Mr. Wegg comes into the room, John takes his hat and throws it out the window, and later Wegg finds himself gripped by the cravat, shaken until his teeth chattered, shoved back staggering into the corner of the room and pinned there. And John Harmon in fact says to him that the wonder is that I didn't try to twist your head off and fling that out of the window. I find this quite interesting because for me it feels like quite out of character, and I think that's partly to show that we still don't know everything about John Harmon, and partly also to show his deep love of the Boffins and his respect for them almost as parents, I think, which is one of the reasons why he hates so much that Mr. Wegg has tried to undermine the Boffins, that he knows to be such good people and that he cares about so dearly. I think that's all I have to say about that chapter, and there are several to talk about today, so I'm going to move swiftly on to chapter 15 of book 4, which is one of my favourite chapters in this book, and one I think is just incredible. Chapter 15, What Was Caught in the Traps That Were Set. Bradley in this chapter is continuing to be thoroughly miserable and distressed. He knows Lizzie and Eugene are married. He knows that no trace is on him and believes that this is Eugene's doing, which distresses him and angers him and infuriates him even more. And then one day Mr. Riderhood shows up in his class, asks the children there what ye might catch in rivers, and holds up a bundle of clothes that he caught in a river, which were the clothes in which Bradley tried to kill Eugene Rayburn. Riderhood has rather a lot on Bradley now. Bradley goes up to see him at his lock, and Riderhood tells him that he couldn't care less about the fact that he tried to kill Eugene, but that Bradley Headstone copied his clothes in order to do it and shook blood on him, that he tried to pin the crime on him. That absolutely infuriates him, and he is determined to blackmail Bradley Headstone for the rest of his life. He wants all of Bradley Headstone's money. He wants Bradley to marry Miss Peacher at the school to get her money so that Riderhood can have that, and that he is, in short, determined to make his life even more of a living hell than it is. And Bradley Headstone decides that that is not to be borne, that he has had enough of life, that there is nothing worth living, and he determines to kill himself and Riderhood in one moment, and flings himself and Riderhood into the river, where they drown. I think it's such a staggering chapter. I think it is such a staggering plotline. Like, one of the reasons why I love this book so much is that I think Bradley Headstone's plotline is so fascinating and so well done. I think I've mentioned on this channel before that quite a few years ago now, I was shortlisted for a short story competition that was Dickens inspired. It was for Dickens's bicentenary, so actually it must have been 5 years ago. More than 5 years ago, in fact. Oh, that's really weird. And basically for this short story competition, you had to write a short story inspired by a character from Dickens. And the short story I wrote, which was shortlisted for that competition, was called Headstone, and it was this chapter. stream of consciousness from the perspective of Bradley Headstone. I'm still quite proud of that. If anyone would like to hear it, let me know and I'll read it aloud on this channel, though obviously with lots of warnings that it contains huge spoilers for our mutual friend. But I wanted to add that to explain how much this chapter fascinates me, how much Bradley Headstone fascinates me as a character, and how much I love this chapter. I think it's brilliant. And so I'm sure I will have lots of interesting things to say about it. I think the way Dickens writes about Bradley's torment is so utterly fascinating and so thoroughly well done. How Bradley Headstone had been racked and riven in his mind since the quiet evening when by the riverside he had risen, as it were, out of the ashes of the bargeman, none but he could have told, not even he could have told, for such misery can only be felt. First he had to bear the combined weight of the knowledge of what he had done, of that haunting reproach that he might have done it so much better, and of the dread of discovery. It was load enough to crush him, and he laboured under it night and day. It was as heavy on him in his scanty sleep as in his red-eyed waking hours. It bore him down with a dread, unchanging monotony in which there was not a moment's variety. And then later, then he saw that through his desperate attempt to separate those two forever, he had been made the means of uniting them, that he had dipped his hands in blood to mark himself a miserable fool and tool, that Eugene Wrayburn, for his wife's sake, set him aside and left him to crawl along his blasted cause. He thought of fate or providence to be a directing power, what it might, as having put a fraud upon him, overreached him, and in his impotent and mad rage bit and tore and had his fit. I think it's so well written. I think Bradley Headstone as a character and his plotline, his kind of tragic story in many ways, is done so thoroughly brilliantly by Dickens. All this time his mind was never off the rack, and his raging sense that having been made to fling himself across the chasm which divided those two and bridge it over for their coming together never cooled down. This horrible condition brought on other fits. I think Riderhood's a very interesting character as well, and it's very interesting to pit these two against each other because they're quite an unlikely pair, and at times in the book they're almost a team, and yet Riderhood is selfish and also confrontational towards anyone, and when he realises that Bradley is trying to set the crime on him, Bradley perhaps thinking that as Bradley himself is a respectable man, and Riderhood is definitely not a respectable man, that it might be easy to pin the crime on him. That is when Riderhood is incensed, and that is when Riderhood is determined to get as much out of Bradley Headstone as he possibly can. Part of the reason why Bradley Headstone decides to kill himself and to kill Riderhood at the end of this chapter is not only because of what he has done and the fact that he cannot live with what he has done, both in terms of his crime against Eugene, but also in terms of actually ending up against his will bringing Lizzie and Eugene together, but also I think it's to do with his sense of degradation, that he has worked all his life against often his own limiting talents to become this respectable teacher, to get this living, and yet he is so utterly miserable, and he's got to the point where he is a criminal who he feels like an outcast and is suffering from deep sort of depression. And three, he has got to this low point in life where he is being blackmailed by someone who he views so entirely below him and who he hates so much, and so he grabs hold of Mr. Riderhood and makes to fling him into the lock. And Riderhood says, "Ain't I told you that the man as has come through drowning can never be drowned? I can't be drowned," which we all know is not true. And Bradley says, "I can be, I am resolved to be, I'll hold you living and I'll hold you dead." Oh, it's so good, it's so well written. I think this chapter is like one of the best chapters ever. I think it's brilliant. I think it's such a perfect scene. It's written so well, and just, yeah, Bradley Headstone's plotline is my favourite thing possibly about our mutual friend. Maybe that's going too far. It's one of my favourite things about our mutual friend, and this chapter I think is just brilliantly, astoundingly written, and I'm quite excited enough. So now I'm going to talk about the next chapter, which is Chapter 16, Persons and Things in General. Also some brilliant stuff in this chapter too. In this chapter we view quite a lot of different characters. We begin with John and Bella in their new home, being rather wealthier now than they used to be, something which makes Mrs. Wilfer, Bella's mother, rather more reconciliatory than she used to be in the past. After that we get one of my favourite little scenes in the whole book, where Sloppy and Jenny Wren first meet, and they might be my favourite couple in the book, even though they only meet for like 2 pages, but we all know where that's going. I know that Dickens likes to like pair up everyone at the end of his books, and that isn't always necessary, but I do think this is a pair which I really enjoy, and I think it's a really lovely moment because both of them are slightly eccentric, both of them have suffered a great deal in life, and both of them have come through and are kind of better and calmer people by the end, and happier people too, and I really love their conversation, and I think Sloppy is such a nice character. We then get to see how Eugene and Lizzie are getting on in their marriage. Eugene is now recovering a great deal more and looking to live on into the future. He has told his father of his marriage to Lizzie, and his father has met Lizzie. Eugene talks to Mortimer and they discuss a little bit about society and what society thinks of Eugene's marriage, and Eugene determines that he will not care, that he will not run away, that he is proud of his wife whom he loves, and that he doesn't care one bit about society. So, points of interest in this chapter. I don't think I have much to say about the first scene in this chapter, except that I love Lavinia a great deal, and she makes me laugh so very much. Dearest Lavinia, urged Mrs. Sampson pathetically, I adore you. Then if you can't do it in a more agreeable manner, returned the young lady, I wish you wouldn't. I probably have more to say about the Jenny and Sloppy conversation. I have underlined a lot, but most of it just has the words yay and smiley faces written by it, so sorry about this. But I think there are really important moments in this conversation. I really like the kind of connection they form, and one of my favourite things in it is that when Sloppy says, you don't live here alone, do you, miss? Jenny says, live here with my fairy godmother, and then, more seriously, with my second father, or with my first, for that matter. And I love that moment because Jenny Wren, who is so playful throughout most of the book, who spends the whole book just referring to her father as my child, who spends the whole time referring to Mr. Ryer as fairy godmother, who spends the whole time pretending that she is older than she is, has this moment of seriousness where she says that Ryer is her second father, which is the only time in the whole book she really acknowledges that her actual father was her first father. And then she says, or my first for that matter, because her actual biological father was never there for her and never acted as a father towards her, which is part of the reason why she always referred to him as my child, to take the responsibility on her shoulders. And that moment of seriousness is something that I really love. One, because I think it shows quite a lot about Jenny's character, and also because it shows that she automatically and very immediately trusts Sloppy, which I really like. And then I also really like the moment between them where he offers to make a handle for the stick that he assumes belongs to her father figure, that he assumes belongs to Mr. Ryer, and she says, it belongs to me, I am lame. And Sloppy says, I'm very glad it's yours because I'd rather ornament it for you than for anyone else, which I think is a really nice moment. And then of course at the end of this little scene, Jenny starts talking, as she does very often, about the man who is coming to court her, which we all know by now is of course Sloppy, and that makes me delightfully happy. That's all I have to say on that one. It's very nice, and I like Jenny Wren very much, and I like the idea that she gets a happy ending with a very nice young man like Sloppy. Anyway, on to the next little bit of this chapter. One of the ways in which we get a sense in this chapter of how Eugene is recovering is that he's got quite a lot of his lightness of phrase back, but at the same time we also get a sense of his kind of moral improvement, and that he also has real moments of seriousness. In his lighter, charismatic moments, he says to Mortimer, MRF, my respected father, who is a much younger cavalier than I and a professed admirer of beauty, was so affable as to remark the other day that Lizzie ought to have her portrait painted, which, coming from MRF, may be considered equivalent to a melodramatic blessing. But then he also has this serious moment later where he mentions to Mortimer that he considered taking his wife away to the colonies. Mortimer suggests that that might be a good idea, that he might be right. No, said Eugene emphatically, not right, wrong. Tell me, shall I turn coward to Lizzie and sneak away with her as if I were ashamed of her? Where would your friend's part in this world be, Mortimer, if she had turned coward to him on an immeasurably better occasion? And my wife is something nearer to my heart, Mortimer, than Tippins is, and I owe her a little more than I owe to Tippins, and I am rather prouder of her than I ever was of Tippins. Therefore I will fight it out to the last gasp, with her and for her, here in the open field. When I hide her, or strike for her faint-heartedly in a hole or a corner, do you whom I love next best on earth tell me what I shall most righteously deserve to be told, that she would have done well to turn me over with her foot that night when I lay bleeding to death and spat in my dastard face. I think Eugene is a great character. He's such a great character. And I think that is all I have to say about that chapter, which brings me on, finally, to talking about the very last chapter of our mutual friend, one I very much enjoy, The Voice of Society. In this chapter we follow Mortimer Lightwood as he goes to a society party, and we hear the judgment on Eugene and Lizzie and their relationship. Most of society pretty much thinks that Eugene has done a very stupid thing to marry someone who is working class, but Mr. Tremlow defends him and says that actually maybe love is a bit more important than class, something which makes Mortimer quite pleased and perhaps makes Mortimer reflect a little bit on his life as well. So, points of interest in this chapter. It's a very short one, but I think a really nice one, and one in which again Dickens emphasises the facade, the pretense, and the immorality, really, of a lot of upper-class society. Notice, of course, it's interesting that the Boffins are not here at this party as they have been at many previously, because the Boffins are clearly keeping better company now with the Harmons and being much happier. Society is incredibly disparaging about Eugene and Lizzie's marriage, marriage. Lady Tippins refers to Eugene and Lizzie as the savages. Someone asks, how was the bride dressed? In rowing costume. And Lady Tippins says, take care if I will faint veneering. Mortimer means to tell us that a horrid female waterman is graceful. Mortimer attempts to defend Lizzie against these awful, awful people, but they decide that they will put the question to the floor and ask everyone at this party what they think. The question, says Lady Tippins, is whether a young man of very fair family, good appearance and some talent makes a fool or a wise man of himself in marrying a female waterman turned factory girl. Hardly so, the stubborn Mortimer strikes in. I take the question to be whether a man, as you describe, Lady Tippins, does the right or wrong in marrying a brave woman, I say nothing of her beauty, who has saved his life with a wonderful energy and address, whom he knows to be virtuous and possessed of remarkable qualities, whom he has long admired and who is deeply attached to him. I really like Mortimer at this moment, because Mortimer's quite an interesting character, because he, on the one hand, is less bad than Eugene. In some ways, I think he is presented as being less careless, as working a bit harder than Eugene, but at the same time he is a little bit more taken in by society at certain points, and yet he loves Eugene a great deal more than society, and he defends Eugene here but also defends Lizzie because he knows and cares about Lizzie too, and because he knows now and he sees that society is so fake and that society's opinions are a lot of the time so awful. Most of society have pretty terrible things to say about Eugene and Lizzie's marriage, but perhaps my favourite opinion, one that does make me laugh, is one person who asks if Lizzie has money and when finds out she doesn't says, madness and moonshine, a man may do anything lawful for money, but for no money, bosh. But the nicest thing in this chapter, and I think what I will end this video on, is what Tremlow says to Mortimer and to the rest of the party about the marriage that has taken place, and in a way I think is Dickens putting his voice on the situation through Tremlow's and sort of pointing out a lot of the main sort of social criticism points. A lot of this book is to do with class and class prejudice, and Mr. Tremlow points out that actually there are some other things which might and ought to have more weight with people than simply class. If this gentleman's feelings of gratitude, of respect, of admiration, of affection induced him, as I presume they did, to marry this lady, I think he is the greater gentleman for the action and makes her the greater lady. So, that has been our mutual friend. That's over now. We've now been reading this for 18 months and it's finished, which is weird. Thank you very much for watching this extra long video of our mutual friend, and if you took part in the read along, which I hope you did, otherwise you really shouldn't be here now because I've just spoiled everything, unless you read the book before, I suppose. But if you took part in the read along, please let me know how you enjoyed our mutual friend, how you enjoyed reading it serially, because reading it serially is slightly odd. Again, there will be a video up about that specific issue quite soon. And also if you would like to do another serialised Dickens read along, what you thought of the ending of our mutual friend, just, yeah, comment down below and let me know your thoughts. I have loved doing this read along in many ways, though it's also been slightly weird to read this book over such a long period of time. I love this book a great deal. Obviously, I love the ending, I love like the beginning and the middle and all of it. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Let me know your thoughts down below, and yeah, thank you very much for watching the final video in the Our Mutual Friend read along, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.